What's up, designers, and welcome back to Rempton Games. Interactivity is one of the main things that separates games from other forms of entertainment. The player has some amount of control over the experience, although the exact amount of control the player has can vary from game to game. This interactivity is a huge benefit to games, as it can draw players in and get them more immersed and invested than a passive experience like a film ever could. However, it can also present some unique challenges from a design and storytelling perspective. A film director has influence over every frame of his film, from how it's shot to how it's edited, what music is added, post-processing effects, visual effects, and more. A game designer, on the other hand, doesn't have the same level of control over the experience because they're giving some of that control away to the player. While a director can decide what the characters do, where they go, and where the camera's pointing, in games it's the players who often decide these things, and their experiences are never going to be exactly the same. Sometimes they can be drastically different. Most of the time this is a very good thing, but occasionally there are instances where the designer feels like in order to improve the experience, they need to take back a little bit of that control without the players necessarily realizing that it's happening. Maybe it's a mechanic that doesn't work quite the way you think it does, or an entirely new system that's working quietly in the background without you even realizing that it's there. It's these unsung heroes that are the topic of today's video. Without further ado, let's get started. While these mechanics aren't necessarily ranked in any particular order, I did want to start with one of the oldest and most well-known examples of a hidden mechanic in games, specifically the behavior of the ghost enemies in Pac-Man. For a game that came out in 1980, the ghost behavior is actually surprisingly complex. Each of the different ghosts, Blinky, Pinky, Inky, and Clyde, have different personalities and actually behave differently when they're chasing Pac-Man. Blinky, the red ghost, simply tries to follow behind Pac-Man, while Pinky, the pink ghost, will try to sneak around and get in front of him. Clyde, the orange ghost, will also try to get behind Pac-Man, but will run away to his home corner if Pac-Man gets too close. Finally, Inky, the blue ghost, has a very erratic behavior that seems to alternate between the three other different styles, sometimes chasing Pac-Man, sometimes trying to get in front of him, and sometimes running away. In addition, the ghosts aren't even always trying to chase Pac-Man, but actually alternate between chasing and scattering. When chasing, they behave as previously described, but when scattering, they simply run away to their home corners to give Pac-Man a bit of a breather. While this behavior might not seem too impressive to modern gamers, it really did stand out at the time, and is one of the earliest examples of a mechanic that's doing far more than it seems on the surface. While Pac-Man may have been one of the first games to experiment with enemy AI, it was far from the last, and there are many games that followed in its footsteps. One surprising example is Amnesia: Dark Descent. Amnesia could be considered the game that kicked off the horror gaming revolution, and for good reason. It has some of the creepiest enemies and moments of any game. These enemies are disgusting to look at, can seem impossible to escape, and often seem like they're appearing out of nowhere. It turns out that all of this is due to a very clever application of a hidden mechanic regarding the behavior of these enemies. Instead of simply following the player around, they actually have the goal of getting as close as possible while staying outside of the player's line of sight. They aren't appearing out of nowhere, they're just programmed to remain out of sight until that moment when you turn around and I don't want to play this anymore. If you're into films, then you already know that one thing critics go crazy for is a good oneer. That is, a long scene or even an entire film that looks like it was done in a single shot. However, while occasionally those scenes are actually done in one take, most of the time they're simply edited together so smoothly that you can't tell where the cuts are. This desire to hide the edits is not only found in film, but can actually be found in games as well. Traditionally, while moving from level to level, you have to sit through long loading screens while the game gets rid of old data and loads up all the new assets. However, load screens tend to be boring and can grind the momentum of the game to a halt, so some designers try to hide the edits by loading without the player realizing that it's happening. Sometimes these attempts can be pretty obvious. Like if you've basically ever ridden an elevator in a game, it's probably a loading screen. But other times they can be much more subtle. If done well, the game can trick the players into not even noticing that the loading even happened. While there are many examples of this, the one I want to highlight today is Tony Hawk's American Wasteland, because the lack of loading between levels was actually a major selling point for this game. However, like any game, it's still necessary to load between levels, so how do they pull it off? It turns out that the levels are connected to one another with tunnels, and the game can subtly control how long it takes for you to skate through the tunnel so that the next level is loaded by the time you get to the other side. In the real world, some things are unchangeable, like the laws of physics. But in a game world, you can control every aspect, including things like gravity. While you might expect the laws of physics in a game to be similar to real life, gravity is often adjusted for a number of reasons, most of which have to do with providing snappier, more responsive controls with less airtime. Some games, however, get a little more creative with their gravity, such as having bullets be slightly attracted to explosive objects to create more explosions. However, for this entry, I want to highlight Half-Life 2. In this game, when you kill an enemy, that enemy will become a ragdoll, and ragdolls are actually slightly attracted to the edge of ledges and cliffs. Why? Because it's fun to watch ragdolls fall and flop around. Do you need any other reason? Have you ever tried using somebody else's computer, and when you try using the mouse, you find that the content doesn't move the way you expect it to? It can be really difficult for your brain to adjust to this new control scheme, and you may wonder why anybody would do it this way when the way that you do it just makes so much more sense. It turns out that it's just one of those things, like whether you wipe standing up or sitting down, that you intuitively do one way without even thinking that there's a whole group of other people doing the opposite. Using inverted controls is another one of those things. You intuitively know how you expect the camera to move when you flick the control stick, and nobody wants to dig through the control settings to make the adjustments when the game gets it wrong. That's why a number of games, like Portal, secretly test the player's Y-axis preference without them realizing it. They usually do this by simply asking the player to look up, and then setting the control scheme based on how the player responds. The player probably thinks the game is trying to teach them the controls, but actually it's the player that's teaching the game how it should behave. Death in games usually isn't that frightening. If you die, most of the time you'll just dust yourself off, respawn at the last save point, and try again. However, not all games work this way. Some games have permanent death with no save points, and if you die, you'll have to start all the way over from the very beginning. This type of mechanic is usually found in games like roguelikes, where the iterations are relatively quick, and every time you start over, the experience is going to be slightly different. You generally wouldn't find this kind of mechanic in, say, a 100-hour RPG. After all, no player would want to invest hours of their time only to die and have to start over from the very beginning. This is why it was so shocking when the game Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice threatened to completely delete the player's save file if they died too many times. This, in and of itself, is not a hidden mechanic. The game clearly states that every time you die, the Dark Rot will take over more of Senua's body, and if you die too many times and it reaches her head, it's permanent game over. In this case, the hidden mechanic is actually a lack of a mechanic. It turns out it's actually impossible to die enough times to cause permadeath in Senua's Sacrifice. This isn't a mistake or a bug. The designers never actually intended there to be permanent death in this game. However, they didn't want the players to know that. The mere threat of losing all of your progress and having to start over from the beginning was enough to significantly increase the tension of the game. Imagine this. You're fighting a boss, but you're pretty evenly matched. You've almost taken them down, but you're at your last sliver of health. However, somehow you manage to stay one step ahead of them and are able to take them out at the last minute. How do you feel? Pretty good, right? Maybe you even feel like a bit of a badass? There's nothing that gets the adrenaline pumping more than narrowly escaping death with your last bit of health, which is why some games actually try to get this situation to happen a little bit more often. How do they do this? By actually making your last sliver of health worth more than it appears. Players will naturally assume that all parts of the health bar are equal. I take X damage, I lose Y health. However, behind the scenes, it doesn't necessarily have to work this way, and some games can manipulate things to keep players on the edge of death more often than not. While this mechanic can be found in several games, I want to specifically highlight the 2016 Doom remake because of just how well this mechanic works with the feeling of being a badass demon slayer. If narrowly avoiding death in games is something that should be encouraged, then it makes sense that the opposite is something that should be avoided. In this case, that means getting killed at full health without a chance to respond. Nobody likes getting shot by an enemy that they can't see, or attacked from behind by a monster that they didn't know was there. To avoid this, some games, such as Bioshock, will actually make sure that the enemies always miss their first shot, so that the player has time to realize that they're being attacked. This gives players just enough warning to try and locate the enemy or defend themselves before being gunned down. There's a common gag in cartoons where a character will run off a cliff and keep running until they realize that there's no ground beneath them. It's a classic joke, but clearly the real world doesn't work that way. Luckily, video games aren't the real world, and you've probably been a Wiley Coyote without even realizing it. In many platforming games, for example, there are situations where you want to get as close to the edge as possible before jumping to maximize your distance. However, if you press the button just a fraction of a second late, your character can no longer jump because they're no longer on the platform and you'll just fall to your death. This can clearly be frustrating for the player, especially if the lag between pressing the button and the input actually being received by the game is long enough to make the difference between successfully jumping and falling to your doom. To avoid this, many games actually give the player a little bit of extra time to jump after walking off an edge. Most of the time this window is so small that the player doesn't really realize that it's there, but it's big enough to avoid most unfortunate close calls. For a final hidden mechanic today, I want to take a look at ammunition. Shooters today are such a popular genre that they're basically the default, and whenever you have guns, you also need ammo. Generally, these games are designed so that you always have a steady stream of ammunition, but there's always the risk of running out of ammo and watching helplessly as your primary weapon is just dangling uselessly at the foreground of the screen. The terror of running out of bullets can only be matched by the feeling of triumph that comes from eliminating your final enemy with your last bullet. To give you a bit more of a chance, some games, such as System Shock, make it so that your last bullet actually does significantly more damage to increase the odds of clearing out your enemies with your final shot. That's all I have for today. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this in the future. If you want to see more, check out my previous video on how to become a Jeopardy champion. I also have over 100 articles on the Rempton Games blog, which you can check out at the link in the description down below. And join me next week for the next entry in my History of Game Design series, where I'll be taking a look at the classic RPG, Dungeons & Dragons. Until then, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.